without any further ado, let me welcome Fernando on the microphone and webcam. Over to you, Fernando.
Welcome everyone again, and thank you for choosing to spend your time in this track with me today, exploring the topic of Agile dependencies. A little bit about me. My name is Fernando Cuenca. I am joining you from Toronto, Canada. I hope you're having a good day so far. It's the day starting here. And well, I am part of Squirrel North. We're a consulting firm based in Canada, but with global reach. And we focus on helping organizations improve their business performance. And we apply a variety of management methods, modern management methods, Agile and Lean, and of course, Kanban. We are all accredited Kanban trainers and consultants. And well, if you're interested in learning more about us, you can always go to our website. There is articles and various resources there. But enough of that. We're here to talk about this topic of dependencies. So I hope this picture looks familiar to you. I'm sure your particular situation may be different, but what all these images have in common is a variety of teams that have dependencies on each other. So they have the need to orchestrate work. Work moves in between them. So that's the problem we're going to tackle in this talk. There are, of course, other types of dependencies between pieces of work, for example. I am not going to be focusing too much about that, but this other problem, the problem of having a multitude of teams doing different work, but collectively having to orchestrate work. So, and there is a solution that has emerged and has become much more popular in the last decade with the advent of Agile, and is of course the solution of the cross-functional team. And we know how that works. We start with a bunch of different teams or groups or departments that depend on each other, and that creates this web of dependency. So we apply some sort of reorganization to the organization. We move people around, and we hope to form these cross-functional teams, so a team that includes specialties and skills from various areas, and hopefully they will become highly independent, so they can deliver without having to depend on each other. And this solution, it's a good solution. It works. It has gained lots of traction in the last year. But at the same time, something that is very commonly found in many organizations, at least organizations we work with, is some level of pushback for this. Some organizations find they can't do this, or that there is some resistance, or that there are some impediments to it. So the first topic I'd like to explore is why are reasons why this is happening? Because as it turns out, there are some practical limits to cross-functionality. So you may find something you will interpret as resistance or pushbacks, but sometimes there are very real reasons why that's happening. So let me tell you back a few stories that I have found as I've worked with different organizations on this. And I worked with one organization once that had multiple teams, and they all were relying on a group of DBAs. So well, going cross-functional would have meant to put a DBA in every single team. Well, but they had lots of teams and a relatively small DBA group. So essentially having a DBA in every team would have meant hiring people. So the first question that you could ask here is, well, can you actually hire them? Do you have the economic ability to hire more people? So there may be some economic realities that will put some limits to how cross-functional you can be. Now, imagine that you can fire them. The next question you could ask is, can you find these people? So I worked later with another organization that was doing some work in the domain of business intelligence. This was several years ago, and this was the days where data scientists weren't that common, so it was the early days of business intelligence and AI. So finding data scientists wasn't that simple. So the next barrier you might find is availability of specialized expertise. So if you can hire the people, can you find them? You may be in a situation where you need very fairly specialized skills, and these people may not be that easy to find. Now, another thing that I found later in another organization was teams relying on, in this case, was a backend team doing work in a mainframe. So it's a kind of an arcane technology, not very common, not a very common skill, but that wasn't really the problem. The problem is that mainframes and applications on mainframes had very specific conventions they need to follow. So in this case, the problem was related to conceptual integrity. So you may be needing to work across different bounded contexts. So areas that require a specific, not just specific knowledge, but a specific following a specific model or very specific rules. And you may not necessarily want to mix that with other people. And the other risk you run here is that once you start moving people around and disperse them, you may lose conceptual integrity. There are, of course, ways around these things like communities of practice, but it adds an additional layer of complexity. So and there may be other reasons that you're not able to break these boundaries. I am thinking, for example, regulatory reasons. In banks, for example, you need to keep investment people separate from daily operations people. So there may be rules that put these boundaries around people that you cannot break. And finally, another very common reason why reorganization into cross-functional teams may face issues, may face problems, is simply cost and stress. So moving people around, the cost of reorganizing physically people in the physical space. When we had physical space, these virtual days, maybe this is easier, but there is some cost and stress associated with the actual reorganization, not to mention things that have to do with political considerations, like people losing power or considering their source of power based on the number of people they have reporting to them and things like that. So these are some of them. But finally, there is another reason, and that has to do with well, if we want to start modeling work end to end. So if we start looking at work end to end from customer need to customer need satisfied, and we look at these end to end workflows, well, it's very unlikely that a single team will actually be able to cover all that flow end to end. And well, there's going to be some level of dependency or need for collaboration between groups. So this is yet another factor. So now, in spite of all this, I see organizations attempting these reorganizations, even when these limits are present. And well, it doesn't end well in many cases. So I remember a case of another organization where they attempted to go beyond IT, because cross-functionality has become a very common thing today within the realm of IT technology engineering. So it's common to have teams with BAs and testers and developers. But now we're trying to extend to other parts of the organization. So this organization was attempting to include marketing people in their teams. And well, they disbanded the marketing group and sent all the analysts to the Agile teams. But guess what? Turns out that work ended up following them, because these marketing analysts were doing work not just for those teams, but other people in the organization. So suddenly these teams found themselves with another source of demand, essentially. So new team members came, and it helped because there was more proximity. It wasn't that there was no value to this, but at the same time there was another source of work that kept following these people. So this reminds me something that my colleague Alexis Zeglob likes to say: organizational structures are fragile, but services are robust. So what this means is that we can reorganize people all we want, move them around, and that's can be done, but the services that the organization provides, so the workflows of value, tend to be robust over time, and they persist regardless of the organizational structure we have. So the point I wanted to draw to your attention at this point is that we cannot wish dependencies away. Dependencies are here to stay. There's always going to be some form of dependency. We can try cross-functionality, and it will help to some degree, but at the same time, dependencies will persist. What that means is that if we figure out a way to manage dependencies effectively, we can actually sort these two problems out. We can solve the problem of dependencies and work around the limitations of cross-functionality. So how can this possibly be done? Well, let's talk about first how we think about the problem. And in Kanban, we have a model for this. Kanban has lots of models for everything, for lots of things. And one of them is for thinking and reasoning about dependency. So here's the model. We like to see the world of knowledge work as services. And we classify those services in first one category of services that we call customer-facing services. So these are the services that provide value directly to customers. internal customers, external customers. You know, these are the sources of value in the organization for customers, and these services may interact with other services that we call internal shared services. So these are the services that are not customer facing, but they are required that do some work for these customer facing services. So there is some flow of work in between these. So we send work to the shared services, and once that work is completed, it comes back, so we can continue with our piece of work and then deliver to the customer. So in each of these services, there is usually, or actually there has to be someone who takes responsibility for keeping work flowing, for keeping an eye on managing flow. We call this person or this group of people that the service delivery manager, an SDM. This is a large topic. This is a role, not a formal position, so it can be implemented in multiple ways, from having a single person to having a group of people, or the responsibility allocated to the whole team. So there are multiple ways of doing this, but the point here is there has to be somebody or a group of somebody who takes care of or accepts responsibility for end-to-end delivery. So these people tend to have then in that position two concerns when it comes to dependency management. That is reliability and predictability of delivery, both from the work we promise to the work we request other people to do for us, and avoiding overloading, because we know that if we overload services, performance will degrade. So how do we do this? How can this possibly work? So let me show you one way that can be used to solve this problem. It would look something like this. So the green manager here, the manager of the shared service, can start by offering all the other teams that will be sending the work a board like this. Now, this is not your typical Kanban board. This is called a reservation board, and it doesn't depict work in progress, but essentially a calendar or a schedule of when work will be started. So the managers from the other teams, the managers from the customer-facing services, come to this board when they want to send or schedule work in the shared service. And well, how do they do that? Well, there are columns here that represent weeks, and these are the weeks where the work will be started by the shared service. So if I am, for example, the manager of the blue service, and I want some work delivered at some point in time, I need to decide which week I want that work started. I will send this work to this green team, for example, in week 3, right? And I put a card in that column. Now, how do I know which column? Well, I know which column because the manager for the green service provides me with another piece of information in the form of SLA, lead time SLAs, and some rules. So here, what this tells me in this example is that for standard work, this team offers an SLA of 3 weeks, and for fixed date work, they offer an SLA of 1 week. So that means that if I need something delivered, let's say in week 5, and I think that can be treated as a standard item, I would need to schedule that 3 weeks in advance. So that's in week 2. But if I need something, let's say in week 4, and it has a fixed date, well, it means that at the latest, I need to schedule that on week 3, 1 week before. Now there is another requirement there, as you see in the to provide the SLA of 1 week for fixed day items. It says I need to have a guaranteed reservation, and that refers to the rows on this table. So the rows on this table, on this board, represent guarantees or the contract that the shared service team offers to his customer teams in terms of when a particular piece of work will be started. So if I place a card on the guaranteed lane, the green team is guaranteeing that the work will be started in that week and then delivered within SLA. So if I put a card on, let's say, week 2 in the guaranteed box, it means that the work is guaranteed to start on week 2, and we will be delivered, let's say, 3 weeks after that, within some boundaries, within some guarantees, within some the terms of some SLA. Now, you also notice that the guaranteed lane has a limit of 8. So that means that I can put 8 cards in each of the boxes. So what the green team here is saying is that they guarantee at least 8 items will be picked up every week, essentially. So if I can get a slot into that row, it means that my work will start on that particular week. Now, if there is additional capacity in the green team that week, then we will start picking work from the reserve lane that can only have 6 items. And then if there is more work after that, the standby, row, but there is less guarantee that that will happen. So this essentially communicates a guarantee first and a level, the extent of that guarantee. So we can only do so much, so we make that explicit in these rows. Now, how can this work? So how can the green manager do this? Well, if we look under the hood, we can see how this works. The green manager can do this, can offer this contract because he or she understands very well the delivery capability of the service that they're managing, right? In terms specifically of throughput and lead time. So if you look at the throughput chart at the top, what you will see there is that the diagram shows a fairly predictable throughput. So it fluctuates, it goes up and down. It's not always the same number, but it fluctuates around an average. And that fluctuation is not wild, but is meaningful in the sense that there are some values in between the minimum, the maximum, and the average, and that there is this minimum value of 8. So that's that means that the team knows that at the very least they deliver 8 items. In the past, at least, they have delivered at least 8 items or more with the maximum of 33. Now, from the point of view of lead time, the lead time distribution is fairly compact. What that means is that there isn't a very long tail to it. It doesn't stretch for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it's not very fat in the tail. And if you filter that lead time distribution by class of service, you will also find that there's a meaningful difference between the two. So there is one distribution for standard items and one distribution for classes of service, both fairly compact and not very long, but there's a meaningful distinction there. So with all this information, you can start offering those guarantees. So the minimum throughput of 8 is what tells you that you can offer that guaranteed class, because if of course this system is also WIP limited, right? So we have some limit of some constraint on the amount of work in the system at any point in time. And we know that we have been delivering at least 8 items per week in this case. That's what the chart shows. So that means that, well, we can offer this guarantee of at least 8 items being picked up every week. That's where the guaranteed 8 number comes from. Now, the rest, the other 6, if you think about the average, you have 20 in average. If you're going to guarantee 8, you still have 12 additional items to reach your average. So in this case, the decision was to distribute evenly between reserve and standby. So this is not the only way of figuring out these numbers. So you can play with the different values that you have and come up with different numbers for the different lanes, depending on your level, the level of risk you can take, or the level of confidence you have in your data, the amount of change you have in your process, and things like that. The point here is that by understanding your throughput, you can figure out what type of guarantees you can make in terms of how much work will be picked up. And finally, well, your lead time distributions will give you information about what type of SLAs you can offer and for which work item type, for which class of service. All right. So essentially, deep understanding of the performance of the service is what allows the green manager to offer this reservation system. Now, if your organization is like most organizations I know, things don't start that way. So normally when I walk into an organization and we start collecting numbers just to see what the performance of the service is, we found a picture that looks more like this. So in terms of throughput, the throughput tends to be erratic. So what I mean by that is that there are many weeks, many intervals where there are no deliveries, and then there are others where there are lots of them, followed by some others where there are some. So the throughput is essentially all over the place, normally with a very low average. And the minimum of 0 will give you a low average right there. And what that means is that if you attempt to build a reservation table based on this throughput data, you won't be able to offer a very credible contract, right? So essentially, there isn't much of a guarantee you can offer. And if you look at your lead time distribution, in these cases, what we normally see is distributions with long, fat tails. So things take a really, really long time to deliver, and most of the work is fixed date. So it's work that has some sort of data attached, and the on-time performance tends to be low. So we make promises that we don't keep. So essentially, what you see is the signature of an unpredictable service, and this has very important ramifications when it comes to managing dependencies. So if you are if you are the manager of a client-facing service and you're looking at your lead time distribution that looks like this, and you're trying to understand why things the time that it takes, something you need to remember is that the lead time of your dependencies will be embedded in the lead time of in your own lead time. So the reason your work takes this long, it's in part because there is a long lead time distribution in your dependencies. So a dependency that is unreliable and unpredictable will make you unreliable and predictable as well. And of course, it also happens for all the other services that consume this shared service, with the additional problem of, now you have multiple services sending uncoordinated requests to this shared service, which often becomes overloaded. And we know that an overloaded service tends to be even more reliable, so this reliability starts propagating all over the place. So the important point here that I'm trying to make is that we tend to think, what I hear most organizations say when they talk about this problem of solving dependencies, is they tend to see the problem as a planning problem. So if we could plan better, if we can do better scheduling, then we would solve the dependencies. And it's actually all the way around. So the ability to plan and to schedule in advance and have a reliable relationship between groups is a capability that will emerge as a result of well-managed dependencies, not the other way around, right? Planning and scheduling is not the solution to unreliable dependencies. You need to solve the reliability problem. And here is the other inconvenient truth, perhaps, is that this is not a one-sided problem. So it's not that the blue manager can solve this or the green manager can solve this, or even the blue manager working with the green manager can do this on their own. All the parties involved in this web of dependencies need to collaborate and work together to optimize the system as a whole. So they all need to collaborate to improve. That's a very important takeaway. Now, how do you do that? Well, in Kanban, we have, as for many things, tools for this, and it all starts with seeing. Kanban is a way of seeing, says Andy Carmichael, and it's the same when it comes to dependencies. In this case, what we need to learn is our identifying our sources of delay. So the things that will prevent work from moving or flowing. And well, we know in Kanban that these sources of delay tend to fall in one of these categories. If we learn to see these things, we will start identifying these things that prevent flow. So multitasking and preemption being the most common. So that's essentially too much WIP. If we have too much work and we need to switch from piece of work to another piece of work, or pieces of work come in that preempt other work, put other work on hold, that's a source of delay right there. But you also have queues and buffers, so places where work accumulates or piles up. The way we decide to batch work, for example, that will introduce delays. Dependencies, of course, that will introduce delays as well. Impediments, failure demand. So failure demand refers to all the work that we need to do because of shortcomings of what we have delivered earlier. So things like defects or workarounds or manual steps or things that complete work that we've done in the past. Now, Kanban also has, of course, ways to deal with this. So we start by building a visual model. I always like to say that visualization in Kanban is the tool that unlocks everything else. So if you can see how your work actually works, that starts giving you ideas. So visualization, building a good visual model for conveying our shared understanding of the work is important. But the next point is having instrumentation to measure flow. So the ability to measure things like lead times and throughput. And the other technique that you will find useful in this particular aspect of sources of delay is blocker clustering. You have Klaus Leopold talking in this conference later, I believe, and he's the one who pioneered this technique, which is essentially about collecting all these blocker stickies that appear on Kanban boards and analyzing the root cause and what was causing all these different blockers, trying to identify commonalities, so and levels of incidence, likelihood, and things like that, and then you can figure out countermeasures and solutions. So once we have all this information, what do we do with it? Well, two things. Kanban guidance for this is you focus on what we call trimming the tail and left shifting the distribution. So what we mean by that is you have a lead time distribution that tends to be very long, and we acknowledge the fact that the delays are what produce the tail. So this is an important thing to understand. The reason things take a long time is for the most part not related to effort or complexity or size of the work, but usually delays. Delays play a significant role in how long things take, and proportionally large role. So you can ignore size for the most part, at least at the beginning. And what that will give you is this long tail of delay. So once you understand what that looks like, you can figure out what your worst case is. So how long things take in the worst case. And by understanding your customers' needs, you can understand what the acceptable case might be. What that gives you is essentially a gap. And that's your improvement gap. So you work to close that gap, to bring that red line closer to the other line. And again, Kanban has a whole set of tools, a large toolbox for this, from WIP constraints to figuring out your adequate batch size and dealing and removing queues, escalation of blockers, explicit policies to strengthen your definitions of done and definitions of ready, reduction of failure demand. So there is very clear guidance on how to address these delays. And once you start applying all these, what will start happening is what we call a left shifting of the distribution. So you start with a distribution that looks like this, long and with a long tail. And as you start adding improvements, the distribution starts changing. Hopefully it becomes more compact, it becomes shorter, the tail starts disappearing, it starts moving, and eventually you end up with something much more compact and short. So if you start with this red, so your starting position is this red curve, and over time, as you introduce improvement, the distribution changes and morphs into this green curve. So this is what we call left shifting. So essentially, your worst case becomes, closer to that acceptable case, and you end up you remove the very extreme values, etc., and hopefully also it moves to the left. The curve moves in the horizontal axis to the left, which means that you become faster. So now, once that starts occurring, once you have these improvements taking place, other conversations become possible. So there are conversations that can occur. One of the things that is that, oops, sorry about that, that customer-facing service manager may start noticing some things about the work. In particular, one of the things you may start noticing is that different pieces of work have different sensitivity to delays. So some work can tolerate some delay as long as the delay is not unreasonable, whereas other pieces of work are very time sensitive. So we have also a way to deal with that in Kanban. Is called essentially classes of service based on cost of delay. So if we have a service that becomes more reliable, both customer facing and in the dependencies, what will start happening is that we can start having this conversation and this contract where we can treat work differently depending on its sensitivity to delay. We can introduce classes of service both in the customer-facing service and in the dependent service. And perhaps what will also happen is that the need for estimating everything will disappear, because we can start relying more and more on standard work being delivered within a certain SLA. And that can propagate all the way up to the customer, that may eventually also realize that there is no need to impose deadlines on everything. So in many cases, we find that not all the demand needs to be fixed date. So if you find yourself in a situation where everything has its fixed date or everything has a date, well, sometimes that happens because of unreliability of delivery. And once delivery becomes more dependable, well, we can have this more nuanced understanding of sensitivity to delay, and understanding that not everything needs a date, and the rest can be just delivered as soon as possible as a standard class of service. Something else can happen at this point, and is it can change the way we approach dependency discovery. So if you look at the way you manage your work today, if you're in a situation of unreliable dependencies, you may find that a significant amount of time is spent upfront doing dependency discovery. So we spend analysis time before commitment or right after commitment trying to discover or find all your dependencies, because if your dependencies are unreliable, you need to engage them early on. You cannot take the hit of a dependency that just shows up. So dependency discovery tends to be an upfront and tends to be a very onerous process. But if the dependencies become more reliable, then there is another possibility. You can just take this time sensitivity into account and give work also different treatment when it comes to dependency discovery. So for those items that have a fixed date, you may end up doing upfront dependency discovery and engaging the dependencies upfront. But for those pieces of work that can tolerate more delay, maybe you will just fast track them through through analysis into development, do a less work spent finding the dependencies, and essentially just find or engage the dependencies when you find them. If you hit the dependency, if you happen to need a dependency, at that point you engage them, because you know that you will have a reliable response from the other end. So this is what we call the let it be dependency management strategy. Essentially, get your services to a point where they are reliable enough, and so that you can just hit your dependencies when you need them, and reserving the option of doing upfront engagement of dependencies when it's needed and there is lots of time sensitivity. So not every item requires upfront dependency management. That's another possibility that opens with a more reliable relationship between groups. So to start wrapping up, the result of all this will be the emergence of a more explicit contract between all the parties involved that are part of a dependency chain. So if we go all the way up to the customer, we start by understanding the urgency. So what's the urgency of customer requests? And we can classify them using these, these are the standard classes of service we use in Kanban, from intangible to expedite. And based on that, we can have then an explicit policy of what the dependency management approach is going to be for work items of this type. And here the important takeaway is that essentially upfront detection is required for fixed date items, whereas for intangible, standard, and expedites, we just let the dependencies be. Now, this kind of assumes that we have also on the dependency an agreement of having a treatment based on a similar class of service. So we have a mapping between customer class of service and dependency class of service, right? Now, it's important to know that this perhaps, in many cases, this level of sophistication is going to be enough. So for many teams and many organizations, many situations, this level of granularity for classes of service and dependency management may be enough, without even going into the reservation system I showed you initially. But if you have a situation that requires that, you can evolve into something that is more sophisticated, more nuanced. It could look something like this. So you could start by having a more nuanced understanding of the customer urgency. You may notice there how the standard class of service and the fixed date class of service can distinguish between different types. So a standard with SLE is the standard work, so the work that needs to be delivered as soon as possible, but within some level, some expectation of delivery timelines. But there are some other cases where that type of work requires a deadline, because delivering after a particular day has no value, right? So and you may notice that results in a difference in class of service in the dependency. So for the standards with deadline, you would require a fixed date in the dependency, whereas for standard with SLE, you would just require a regular standard treatment on the dependency. But both have the let it be dependency management strategy. And now for fixed date items, the additional element here is that in addition to upfront detection of the dependency, you would require, as part of your definition of ready, the ability to acquire a reservation in your reservation board. So if you have something that has a fixed date, for example, and you can distinguish fixed dates, regular fixed date items and fixed date items with zero tolerance. So fixed date items with zero tolerance are those that have a very strict deadline that you cannot miss. Fixed date, well, sometimes there is a wiggle room around the date. So there may be some distinction there. The difference here is that you may require, if you have such distinction in fixed date items, you could make that explicit by having a different reservation type in your dependency. What this means is that in addition to this upfront dependency management, in order to commit to delivering a fixed date item, you would also require having a reservation in your dependency. So you know that by the time you hit the dependency, because it's time sensitive, you will have capacity allocated in the dependency, right? So you can complement classes of service, a dependency management strategy, and a reservation system, all this time together the multiple items. Of course, this assumes that you have worked on making the whole system predictable, right? And another important takeaway here is that this explicit dependency management is required only for true fixed date items, which should be around 15% of your demand. Of course, your situation will vary. It doesn't mean you will have exactly that percentage, but it's a relatively low number of items that require upfront dependency management and careful detection of dependencies. All right. To start wrapping up, so a few key ideas. The first one, no wishful thinking when it comes to dependency management and cross-functionality. So there are some very practical limits to establishing cross-functional teams that you need to take into account that may pose barriers to your ability to have dependencies. So to reorganize into cross-functional teams. So it's only going to take you so far, and dependencies are at the end going to stay anyways in one way or another. So the solution to this problem is not planning or more scheduling. Actually, it's all the way around. Unpredictable dependencies is what makes your dependencies, or unpredictable services is what make you unpredictable. So you need to work on predictability and solving that, so that you acquire the ability to do planning and scheduling upfront or over time. And in order to tackle the problem, the strategy is, as in many other things we in common, is striving for reliable and predictable interactions, where essentially we collaborate to trim the tail. So the other important takeaway from this talk should be that the solution to dependency management is really a collaboration between dependent services to take the system to a better, more predictable place. That it's important to essentially use trust to reduce the need for imposed deadlines. This is what causes lots of grief in many organizations. And well, it's important to understand that as reliability goes up, as predictability goes up, the trust will increase to the point where we can have a more nuanced conversation around sensitivity to delays, once delays become something more manageable. Think probabilistically about scheduling and planning in general. So instrument your services for lead time and throughput and flow metrics, so that you can have an X-ray view into your process and understand where those dependencies lie. And finally, remember that it doesn't have to be very complicated. So dependency management can be just simple as let it be, provided that your system have achieved some level of predictability. More exotic solutions like reservation systems are available for more complex scheduling situations, but they require first a higher level of maturity. You need to do more work to have something like that working, and it may not be necessary for your situation. So you may again, if you work on getting something that is predictable, a system that predictably works as a whole, then that may be enough to just solve this problem of dependencies. One additional piece here. So there is this poster that Kanban University has created about dependency management. It talks about some of the topics I've discussed and some others. I believe David Anderson will be speaking about this in his closing keynote. So stay tuned for that. It can be downloaded from the KMN site or for the KMN Plus site. I believe it's also available there. And it has much more details about the techniques I've described. And with that, that's all I had to share with you at the moment. And I thank you for your time. I hope this was useful. And let's open the floor for questions if there is any.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you for an excellent presentation. It was wonderful to have you in the event and have you presenting in Kanban India 2020. We have received a couple of questions, Fernando. I'll read out for you to them one by one. So before we begin with that, we have 4 minutes in hand and I'll be taking questions accordingly. The first question we have is, can we define a cross-functional team? And the question follows, people who can do everything seems like people without speciality. And isn't it more like having specialists that have enough knowledge to help the others if needed? What is your opinion?
Yeah, well, so by cross-functional team, what we mean is a team that has multiple skills from multiple areas. It doesn't mean that every person in the team will be specialist. Depending on how you're forming the team, they could be generalists too. So I think that the word you're looking for here is what is normally called T-shaped people. So nobody's just a specialist in one area. So we all have some area of specialty where we go really deep, and we have some areas on the side that we just extend. So the only difference between people is how long the top of the T is, right? So I think the answer to the question is you will never have only specialists in a cross-functional team. You normally have T-shaped people. Now, some people will have a very narrow T, some people will have a very long T, right? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Fernando. Now, moving on to the next question by Marco. He's asking, based on your experiences, how many years a large-scale company, approximately 300 plus people, 30 plus teams, require to strive this level of maturity?
Oh, well, that's $1 million question, right? Well, the thing is, we can't really predict, right? That's a large organization, and large organizations tend to move very slowly, right? So the larger organization, I would say the longer the time. I don't have a number I can give you. Now, the thing is, what we need to remember is the way we do things in Kanban is one service at a time, right? So you never start a Kanban initiative as a big bang change that we say we'll start today, we'll end up 3 years from now. It's something that will start organically one service at a time. So that to answer that question, you would need to know things like how many of these services you are Kanbanizing in parallel, for example. What are the problems they are facing, and how much can they move into the solutions? So for an organization of that size, I would say several years. I don't have a number I can give you, and unfortunately, there is no formula for that. It's not going to be a matter of months. It's probably going to be in the scale of years, right? Now, here's the other thing. It's not a black and white situation, like we're immature today or mature tomorrow, right? Maturity is a scale. You will increase maturity over time, and you will start realizing value of this as you go, right? So you will start solving problems. I was showing this picture of a left shifting distribution. So the initial steps in the left shifting tend to be the most notable and radical ones. So as you start making improvements, there's going to be lots of improvements early on, and then there's going to slow down. So you will realize improvement early on.
Thank you, Fernando. We have lots of questions, but with the interest of time, we have to stop taking the questions. We'll take them offline with you.
If you send me the questions later, I can send you an email with the response.
Sure. So I'll be sharing the questions post the event with you so that you can answer them. And thank you once again for this wonderful session, Fernando. It was
Thank you so much for having me here, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.